Now, on a bit more of a serious note, we were trying to determine how you'd describe your brand of humor. How would you describe it?
Funny.
When most people hear the names Cheech and Chong, a very specific image comes to mind. Two perpetually relaxed guys, squinting through a haze of smoke, delivering punchlines with a kind of effortless timing that most comedians spend their entire lives chasing. They are, without question, two of the most recognizable figures in the history of American comedy. Their names alone carry decades of counterculture history, rebellion, laughter, and a kind of laid-back genius that the entertainment world has rarely seen replicated. But here is the thing about legends: the surface of their story is almost never the whole story. And with Cheech and Chong, the deeper you dig, the more fascinating and surprising things become. Because underneath the pot jokes and the cult classic films, underneath the iconic catchphrases and the sold-out tours, there is a story that most fans have simply never heard. A story full of unexpected beginnings, near misses with horror movie icons, painful laughs from Hollywood royalty, and a creative process so unconventional it would make most film school professors do a double take. This is not just a tribute to two funny guys. This is a deep dive into the real, raw, and remarkable world of Cheech and Chong. And by the time you reach the end, guaranteed, you will be looking at them in a completely different light. Let's start at the very beginning, because the way Cheech Marin and Tommy Chong actually found each other is the kind of story that sounds like something from one of their own movies. It is almost too perfectly strange to be real, and yet every bit of it is true. Richard Cheech Marin was born and raised in South Los Angeles. His father was a police officer, and by all early indications, Cheech was heading toward a quiet, creative life far removed from comedy stages and movie sets. He had enrolled at California State University Northridge to study pottery.
Not performance art. Not improv. Pottery.
Clay wheels, kilns, and glazes were where his mind was focused. But the late 1960s had a way of derailing even the most carefully laid plans, especially for young American men. The Vietnam War draft was casting a long shadow over an entire generation. Faced with the very real possibility of being sent to fight in a war he deeply opposed, Cheech made a decision that would quietly change the trajectory of comedy history. He left the United States and fled to Canada. It was a bold, risky move, one that uprooted him from everything familiar and dropped him into Vancouver without a clear plan or a safety net. He took whatever work he could find, drove trucks, unloaded carpets, and kept working on his pottery when time allowed. Life was uncertain, but it was in this state of beautiful, chaotic uncertainty that fate was quietly setting the stage. Tommy Chong, meanwhile, had already lived a few different lives by the time their paths crossed. Born in Edmonton, Alberta, to a Chinese father and a Scottish-Irish mother, Tommy had actually tasted genuine musical fame before he ever told a single joke professionally. He had played guitar in a band called Bobby Taylor and the Vancouvers, a group that earned a record deal with Motown Records. That alone would have been a remarkable enough chapter for most people's life stories.
But Tommy moved on.
By the early 1970s, he was running a Vancouver establishment called the Shanghai Junk, a club where he had blended burlesque entertainment with something far more experimental: improv comedy sketches performed between acts. He called his sketch troupe City Works. It was weird, it was original, and it was entirely Tommy Chong. Then one night in 1970, a young man named Cheech Marin walked into that club looking for any job that would cover his rent. He was not auditioning. He was not hoping to be discovered. He just needed work. Tommy looked at him, sensed something, and invited him to join the improv group on the spot. What followed was the birth of one of the greatest comedy partnerships the world has ever seen. During one of their early improvised performances, the two fell into an unscripted routine about a man looking for his friend Dave. The other man, apparently too stoned to grasp the situation, kept responding with the now immortal line, "Dave's not here." The audience erupted. Nobody had planned it.
It simply happened.
And from that single spontaneous moment, Cheech and Chong was born. One of the most enduring myths surrounding Cheech and Chong is that their on-screen chemistry translated perfectly into real life. That off-camera, they were the same easygoing, carefree duo audiences fell in love with. The truth is considerably more complicated, and considerably more human. By Cheech Marin's own account, he and Tommy Chong were never quite best friends in the conventional sense. Their bond was something more complex than friendship and more turbulent than a simple professional partnership. Cheech once compared their dynamic to that of brothers, not brothers who necessarily chose each other, but brothers who were bound together by shared history, mutual investment, and an almost involuntary loyalty. And like real brothers, they fought. Sometimes fiercely. Creative tension was at the core of their friction. Both men were genuinely talented, both had strong artistic visions, and both wanted their contributions recognized and respected. For most of their collaborative career, Tommy Chong took on the role of director on their films, while both were credited as writers. But Cheech felt the balance of power was uneven, that his creative input was being diminished or overlooked in favor of Chong's singular vision. This was not a small grievance. When you have spent years building something from nothing, from an unscripted moment in a Vancouver club all the way to Hollywood films, the question of who gets credit and who gets control matters enormously. Chong, to his credit, would later look back on that era with something approaching genuine reflection. He admitted that gaining access to the director's chair had changed him in ways that were not entirely positive. He described how the authority of directing can quietly become something intoxicating, how the feeling of having the final say on everything can evolve into a kind of creative stubbornness that pushes other voices out. He called it a form of megalomania. It is a remarkably honest thing for anyone to admit about themselves, and it says something meaningful about the kind of person Chong ultimately became with the benefit of hindsight and distance. The breaking point came in 1985. Cheech had written a song called Born in East LA, a comedic riff on the famous Bruce Springsteen song that used the lens of Latino identity to explore ideas about belonging and cultural misunderstanding. He wanted Chong to be involved.
Chong declined.
That refusal, perhaps more than any single argument or creative disagreement that came before it, severed something fundamental between them. Cheech went ahead and made the song and the short film that accompanied it entirely on his own. Both were successful. But success sometimes arrives wearing the clothes of a beginning rather than an ending, and for Cheech, this was a beginning without his longtime partner. Their 17-year collaboration came to a close, not with a dramatic public falling out, but with a quiet, painful divergence of paths. Now, here is where things take a genuinely wild turn. Among all the strange and surprising footnotes in Cheech and Chong's history, this one stands in a category entirely its own. At some point during the mid-1980s, there was a real, serious conversation about putting Cheech and Chong into a Friday the 13th movie. Let that sink in for a moment. Tom McLoughlin, the director responsible for Friday the 13th Part 6, Jason Lives, had breathed new creative energy into the long-running slasher franchise with his 1986 entry. The film had been a success, and McLoughlin was thinking ahead. His vision for a follow-up involved something genuinely unprecedented, a collision between the world of horror and the world of stoner comedy. He pitched the concept to producer Frank Mancuso Jr., proposing that Cheech and Chong either be running a secret marijuana-growing operation deep in the woods near the infamous Crystal Lake, or that they stumble into the story as two hopelessly unprepared camp counselors who find themselves face to face with one of cinema's most unstoppable killers. Think about what that film could have been. Cheech attempting to reason with a masked, machete-wielding Jason. Chong somehow remaining completely unbothered by the supernatural chaos unfolding around him. The comedic possibilities were, in their own bizarre way, genuinely enormous. The project never got off the ground, for reasons that have never been fully explained publicly. But the fact that it was even seriously discussed says something fascinating about both the era and the strange gravitational pull that Cheech and Chong exerted on popular culture during their peak years.
They were not just comedy stars.
They were cultural phenomena, the kind of names that producers attached to projects in the hope that some of their magic would rub off. If you want a measure of how funny Cheech and Chong's debut film, Up in Smoke, truly was, consider the following story, which comes from producer Lou Adler and has gone largely unnoticed outside of dedicated fan circles. When Jack Nicholson attended an early screening of Up in Smoke, he was not in good physical shape. He had recently been in a car accident that had left him with a dislocated shoulder. For anyone who has experienced a dislocated shoulder, the idea of sitting in a movie theater and being expected to laugh freely sounds like a form of mild torture. Every movement of the upper body sends sharp, radiating pain through the joint. Laughter, which involves the entire torso and cannot be easily controlled or suppressed, is particularly brutal. Nicholson had reportedly been advised by his doctor not to laugh. Those were his instructions.
Do not laugh.
Coming from anyone else, that instruction might have been workable. But this was a Cheech and Chong film. And Jack Nicholson, for all his legendary cool, simply could not hold himself back. According to Adler's recollections, Nicholson sat through that screening producing these involuntary, pain sounds, half laugh, half groan, a series of yelps and winces that accompanied every punchline. He was laughing through genuine pain, and he could not stop himself. What makes this story so wonderful is the almost accidental quality of what it produced. Nicholson's painful reactions essentially became an organic test of the material. If a joke was strong enough to force laughter out of a man with a dislocated shoulder who was actively trying not to laugh, that joke was indisputably working. His suffering became, unintentionally, one of the most pure and honest audience tests the film could have hoped for. There is something poetic about that. And as a charming little postscript to the story, the beat-up Volkswagen Beetle that Tommy Chong's character drives in the opening scenes of Up in Smoke was not a studio prop. It was Jack Nicholson's actual personal car. The same man who laughed through shoulder pain in the screening room had contributed his own vehicle to the very film that was causing him so much agony. Hollywood has seen its share of unconventional creative processes. Films have been made from single-page ideas, from dreams, from scribbled napkin notes. But even by the loosest standards of independent filmmaking, Cheech and Chong's approach to their 1981 film Nice Dreams occupies a special place in the annals of cinematic improvisation. The screenplay for Nice Dreams was reportedly 3.5 pages long. To put that in perspective, a standard Hollywood screenplay runs anywhere from 90 to 120 pages. Even short films typically require 10 to 15 pages of properly formatted script. 3.5 pages is, by any conventional measure, not a screenplay. It is closer to a very detailed text message. And yet, from those 3.5 pages, Cheech and Chong built a full-length feature film that was released in theaters and became yet another successful chapter in their comedy legacy. The original concept involved the duo playing landscapers who were secretly cultivating marijuana across Los Angeles, maintaining a perfectly innocent professional front while running a decidedly less innocent side operation. It was the kind of premise that fit their personas perfectly. But as development continued, the idea evolved into something even more gloriously absurd. Cheech and Chong selling marijuana out of an ice cream truck decorated with a giant clown face.